but I'm determined to try. I'm a good pilot. The Emperor needs good pilots, the man said, his smile actually genuine for a moment. Very well, let's get you started. The next week was a calculated nightmare. The first step was a thorough physical, more detailed than any Han had experienced before. The medical droids poked and prodded places that made Han long to give them a swift kick in their circuitry, but he bore it all stoically. He was very tense during the eye exam, but Nissy's droid had been an expert. The Imperial medical droid found nothing wrong. Han passed the physical with flying colors. His reaction time and reflexes were in the topmost percentile. Then came the hard part. Day after day, a steadily dwindling group of cadet candidates were ushered into private examination rooms. Each room came equipped with an examination droid, who posed the questions to the candidates, recorded their scores, and kept tabulations of their standing. Each night Han went back to his tiny little cubicle in yet another flophouse and fell asleep, exhausted, only to dream all night of taking exams. Cadet Candidate Solo, I am going to show you 4 types of body armor. Which of these was used by the Mandalorian forces during the last century? And, Cadet Candidate Solo, in what year did our glorious Emperor become President of the Imperial Senate? What historical event preceded his election? And, Cadet Candidate Solo, if a Victory-class Star Destroyer leaves Imperial Center at the displayed time, and carries the mass and weight of armament, cargo, and troops, as displayed on this screen, which course and approach vector to the Daedalus system will produce the most fuel efficiency? Which course and approach vector will produce the best speed? Be prepared to show the figures for your answer. And, Cadet Candidate Solo, which battle of the Nulian crisis brought about the liberation of the Bahan sector? On what date was it fought? Worst of all, as far as Han was concerned, were the cultural questions. Each cadet was expected to be an officer and a gentleman, or woman, and a certain amount of cultural acumen was required. Han sweated his way through questions such as, Cadet Candidate Solo, I am going to play music from 3 different worlds. Please identify the planet of origin of each piece of music. Ironically, Han was much better at answering the art questions than the music ones. His background as a thief and burglar had given him at least a passing acquaintance with art history and modern galactic art. When, after 3 days of relentless examinations, Han found himself still listed among the cadet candidates on the vidboard in the giant hall of admissions, he was both surprised and ecstatic. The piloting tests covered the last 2 days of the week-long testing period. During this portion, Han's experience stood him in good stead. The candidates were taken off-world in large transports and shipped to nearby Imperial bases. Only one section of the advanced placement testing was conducted on Coruscant itself. Every day, the candidates practiced piloting in a variety of different situations. Han did well, and knew he'd passed each test. Only one off note was struck, one of Han's testing officers. Human instructors were used during this portion. Commented sourly to the other instructors that he felt that Han's fastest time for assigned run score should be stricken because it was highly irregular for a cadet candidate to fly a shuttle through Emperor Palpatine's Arch of Triumph on Imperial Center, rather than above it. He frightened several thousand Imperial citizens. We received hundreds of complaints. The officer sputtered. The head testing officer shrugged. Nobody was injured, right? Correct, sir. Then Cadet Candidate Solo's score stands. Those citizens could use a little excitement from time to time. Good for their circulation, the head testing officer decided. Han was careful not to let on that he'd overheard the exchange. The Corellian knew that while he'd done well on the piloting examinations, he'd passed several of the other subjects by the barest skin of his teeth. Several times a minus sign appeared beside his name, indicating that he would be slated for remedial studies in that area, should he pass and be accepted into the academy. Not surprisingly, music was among those areas, as was ancient pre-republic history, interspatial quantum physics, and nonlinear hyperspace geometry. Han studied every night and fell asleep to the sounds of cram recordings, droning reams of information as he slumbered. Actually, Han didn't really mind dreaming endlessly about the examinations each night. It beat dreaming of Bria. Finally, the day came when he stood before the vidboard and looked for his name on the list of disqualified candidates, and failed to find it. Heart pounding, scarcely daring to hope, he went over to look at the other list across the hall, the one labeled Cadets Accepted. Han Solo. There it was, in glowing letters. Han stared at it, unable to think, hardly daring to believe it. But there it was. He hung around the hall for an hour, and went back 3 different times, and it was there every time. Finally, after the 3rd time, Han allowed himself to whisper, "Yes!" and pump his fist into the air in triumph. He walked down the steps and out into the massive top-level plaza, feeling the cold evening air of Coruscant, like a dash of cold, refreshing water. This calls for a celebration, he thought exultantly. Han treated himself to dinner at one of the posh upper-level restaurants, not too far from the Hall of Admissions. He ordered Nerf medallions in tangy red sauce, with a side order of fried tubers, and a salad of assorted greens. He also ordered an Alderaanian ale, which he sipped slowly, savoring it. Once, during dinner, he glanced around at the beautiful decor, taking in the swanky metal and living ice sculpture, the muted jizz trio, and the human servers. Several high-ranking Imperial officers were there, escorting attractive women in beautiful evening gowns. Han raised his glass unobtrusively into the air and whispered, "Bria, I made it. I sure wish you were here to share this with me, sweetheart." After paying the exorbitant price for the meal without a single regret, Han walked out of the restaurant and strolled across the broad, elegant plaza. The weather deflector mounted high above the plaza kept off most of the wind, so he was almost warm enough as he walked. He sealed up his old jacket against the chill. All around him, and above him, Han could see the topmost spires and roofs of the highest buildings. This plaza was located right below the highest level in this part of Coruscant. Long, corkscrewed ramps led up to the upper level, in addition to the ubiquitous turbolifts. Once out of the brightest glare of the lights, Han leaned against a railing and tried to see the stars. He picked out 1 or 2 of the brightest, but the horizon completely overshadowed the heavens. Red and green auroras shimmered and flickered, seemingly painted against the blackness by some mad, gargantuan artist. It was a breathtaking view. "I made it." Han smiled, and then froze, as something hard and small and round jabbed into the small of his back. The muzzle of a blaster. A voice Han recognized, even though it had been nearly 5 months since he'd heard it, said jovially, "Hey, Han. Good to see you again, boy. I have to admit, you weren't easy to find." This can't be happening, Han thought. Not now. It's not fair. The genial tones held a chuckle, now. "Han, why don't you turn around real slow and easy, and let's talk face to face?" Han turned, very slowly, and as he had known he would, found himself face to face with Garrus Shrike. The captain of Trader's Luck had replaced his gaudy uniform with his old bounty hunter's garb of scarred leather vest, trousers, and snug-fitting Alderaanian Nerf wool tunic, but otherwise he looked exactly the same as he had the night Han had left him sprawled unconscious on the deck plates. No, Han thought, there's something different. After a moment he realized that he was looking slightly down at Shrike. "It's me that's different." I've grown a little. I'm taller. Shrike scrutinized him. Well, ain't you handsome, boy? He said. Too bad you can't come back with me to the Luck and let some of the ladies get a look at you. You'd be a real favorite, I'm sure. Han finally found his voice. What do you want, Garrus? He demanded coldly. Oh, so it's Garrus now, is it? Think you're my equal, do you? The man backhanded Han viciously across the face. When Han started to react, the blaster dug threateningly into his midsection. Silently, the younger man wiped blood from a split lower lip. Well, you're not my equal, and don't you forget it. All you are to me is a pile of credits from the Hutts for bringing VYKK Drago back to them alive. The Hutts are looking for me? Han asked, stalling for time. They're looking for VYKK Drago, and Genos Idanian, and all the rest of your aliases, boy. But you're Han Solo now, aren't you? And I'm the only one in the whole galaxy, practically, who knew that Han Solo was also VYKK Drago and all those others. So when I saw the Hutt advert, I decided to come out of retirement just for you. Too many credits to pass up. I see, Han said. Shrike rocked his head back with another hard slap. No, you don't see, Han. You don't see that things ain't been going good for the Luck lately. You don't see that Laird's never been the same since your Wookiee hag dislocated his arm. Those credits from the Hutts are gonna turn things around for all of us. Really? Han asked. I don't see how just capturing me is going to change your luck. You'd do better to pull some kind of scam on Gamor. And I'm afraid, Garrus, that I can't go along with this little scheme of yours. As he spoke, Han had begun lowering his voice, little by little, speaking more and more softly. Unconsciously, Shrike leaned forward slightly to hear. Just as Han, with a wild scream, leaped straight at him. One arm swept up in a block, sweeping Shrike's arm, and almost at the same moment, Han brought his knee up into the man's groin. As Shrike doubled over with a grunt, Han punched him in the jaw, hard. The captain went down. The blaster dropped out of Garrus's hand, and Shrike grabbed for it. Han kicked it away, sending it skittering into the black, sharp-edged shadows. Then he leaped over Shrike's crouched form and bolted for the ramp leading up to the tallest roof. From there he could hide and catch a horizontal tube or a turbolift. Han couldn't believe he'd actually managed to down Shrike in a fight. While he'd been growing up, he'd lived in terror of the captain's temper and his hard fists. Han reached the ramp and went up the corkscrew with the rush of a ship using full thrusters. He reached the top of the ramp and hesitated, looking around. The rooftop looked otherworldly with its double-edged shadows from Coruscant's 2 small moons, edging everything into aching, sparkling white and bands of gray that plunged into impenetrable darkness. As Han headed out across the rooftop, still scanning for a turbolift, a blue bolt shot out of the darkness at his right. The shot had come from the doorway of a turbolift. Blaster on stun, Han thought, running again, zigzagging frantically. Shrike? How could he have got up here so fast? Another stun beam. Han bolted across the rooftop like a Vrelt running before a blaster ray, running as he'd never run before in his life. He passed another turbolift entrance, pulled up, and headed toward it. As he reached it, the door opened, and Shrike stood there, silhouetted in the doorway, blaster in hand. Han skidded to a halt on the icy permacrete and reverse direction. Shrike here? Who fired those other shots, then? But he was too busy racing across the rooftop to give the question much consideration. Shrike's blaster spat, blue-green in the shadows. The uppermost level was mostly reserved for courting couples and was not well lit. Only the light of Coruscant's 2 small moons illumined the area. Han's breath was visible in the darkness as he raced across the permacrete, leaping over curbs and exposed conduits. The uppermost spires of several buildings stuck up from the permacrete like grotesque stone evergreens. Han hurdled one and skidded on hoarfrost as he landed. It was cold up here, away from the protection of the weather deflector. His leather jacket offered little protection. "Stop or I'll fry your ass!" Shrike yelled, and another stun beam split the night. Han lengthened his strides, fleeing like a hunted animal, desperate to escape. Daring to look back over his shoulder, he saw Shrike's dark form light up faintly in the reflected glow from another stun beam. Turning forward again, Han ran faster, harder, only to come to a screeching halt and stand teetering on the edge where the permacrete dead-ended. Arms windmilling, Han threw himself backward. He had a brief glimpse of the gorgeously lit plaza, 10 or more stories below him, including the elegant restaurant where he'd eaten dinner. Through the shimmer of the weather deflectors, he could see the elegant statues, the exotic flowers and greenery. Dinner seemed a lifetime ago. Han turned right, skidding a little, and headed the other way. Another stun beam lashed at him. His breath burned his chest as he gasped in the freezing air. He hurdled another spire, felt it brush the inside of his trouser leg, but made it and ran on, dodging into a patch of shadow to escape another stun bolt. The shadow suddenly gave way to complete and utter emptiness as an air shaft dropped away into nothingness. Han was going too fast to stop. With a yell of terror, he leaped as hard as he could, and managed to clear the yawning gap. He landed heavily on the other side, fell, and rolled over, gasping, wind knocked out, trying to get to his feet again. He skidded on the icy permacrete, flailing, just as a stun beam splat right beside him. Han's entire right side went numb. The Corellian crashed back to the permacrete with an agonized grunt. Letting himself go limp, he waited, hoping that he'd regain the use of his right side in time. Depending on the intensity level Shrike was using, it might take 2 minutes, or 10. Breathing was torture, but Han gulped down every lungful, ignoring the pain. He needed to get his wind back, in case feeling returned to his right side. Footsteps approached from his left. Shrike, going around the air shaft Han had hurdled. Han lay still. Only the white plume of his breath revealed that he still lived. The footsteps paused beside him, circled him. Han could see Shrike's form dimly, through his eyelashes. Then a boot kicked him viciously in his right leg. Han gasped with the pain. "You low-life scum," Shrike spat. "For 2 credits I'd dump your worthless hide off the edge for what you did." The fact that Han could feel pain in the place where Shrike's heavy boot had struck him was good. The stun paralysis was wearing off. But Han did not move, only lay limp as Shrike grabbed him by the collar of his jacket and dragged him over the permacrete, bumping and slithering, toward the nearest turbolift. The trader captain was cursing steadily and, Han realized with a flare of satisfaction, walking with a distinct limp. The Corellian made himself the heaviest, deadest weight he could as he bumped along over the rooftop, feeling the icy scrape of the permacrete. His right hand tingled as it dragged, and that was good, too. When Shrike reached the turbolift, he let go of Han's collar. It was hard to just let himself fall, but Han managed to make it look good, without banging his head too hard. Shrike's glittery-eyed countenance, a bruise darkening his jaw, appeared in his field of vision. "Now we're going down in this lift, and you're going to behave yourself, you little vrelt. We're going to be real chummy, you and me. I'm going to say you're my buddy who had too much to drink." Han could hear the turbolift coming. He flexed the muscles of his right leg, his right arm. They responded, if sluggishly. He didn't have much time. "So tell me, Han, did you make it into the Imperial Academy?" Shrike asked, just as though Han could speak. Is that why you were out treating yourself good tonight, eh? He laughed. The imps must be real hard up if they take a loser like you. He spat, and warm spill hit Han's face, just above his right eye. Han was careful not to react. The turbolift was very close. When those doors opened, Shrike would be distracted for a few precious seconds, and then he would make his move. Imperceptibly, Han flexed his right fingers, and they answered the command of his brain. Shrike was still ranting. Those Imperials can't shoot straight, can't pilot, and can't fight worth a hoot. It's a wonder old Palpatine can get himself out of bed in the morning. All a bunch of losers. The turbolift doors opened. Shrike looked up, just as Han lunged up off the permacrete. The element of surprise served him for a moment. Han managed to knock the blaster out of Shrike's hand again, but then Garrus was on him. Iron-hard hands clamped around the younger man's throat. Han's eyes bulged as he hooked a leg behind Shrike's and sent the man over backward. Shrike didn't release his grip, so Han went down with him, and they landed in a kicking, punching sprawl. Han slammed a fist into Shrike's midsection, heard the man grunt in pain. The fingers around his throat loosened for a second, then Shrike released his grip and tried to gouge Han's eye. His right eye. The viciously gouging thumb skidded in Shrike's own saliva, and Han turned his head and snapped like an animal. His teeth closed on Shrike's thumb, clamped down. Shrike screamed as Han tore his flesh. The Corellian tasted blood. Han took advantage of the man's momentary distraction to bring his knee up into Shrike's midsection. The older man's breath whooshed out in a stinking rush of white into the cold night air. Han heaved upward, throwing Shrike off him. The man lost his grip and went sprawling backward. Han scrambled for where he'd heard the blaster land, and his fingers found it. Shrike was already up and heading purposefully for the younger man. When Han came up onto his knees, the blaster pointed directly at him. Han ostentatiously thumbed the intensity level up to its highest setting. "Your turn to freeze, Shrike," he said. Speaking brought on a spasm of coughing and searing pain in Han's abused throat, but he managed to get Shrike in his sights. Shrike laughed, and slowed, but didn't stop. He was perhaps 6 meters away. "Now, Han, son," he said coaxingly. "Old Captain Shrike was just having a little fun with you, is all. I wasn't going to turn you over to those huts, no indeed. Did you know you killed one of them, boy? Huts don't like that, no they don't. They're never going to stop searching for old VYKK Drago, you know?" "Stop right there," Han said, and was terrified to hear the quaver in his own voice. He'd never shot anyone down in cold blood before. Especially someone he knew. Could he do it? Shrike grinned as if he could read Han's mind. "Come on, Han. You know you ain't going to shoot me." "You can't. I'm like your daddy, almost." Han shook his head and replied with a Huttese obscenity so blistering that Shrike raised his eyebrows. "Oh my, you've developed such a dirty mouth while you were gone, ain't you, kid?" He was still moving. Only about 4 meters separated them now. Han tightened his grip on the blaster, but he was horrified to realize the muzzle was wavering. "Let's go down below and talk about this, Han," Shrike said, his voice low and soothing. "I won't hurt you, you've got my word on it." "Your word?" Han laughed, then coughed. "That's a laugh. Your word isn't worth spit." "Sure, my word. Besides, if you shoot me, boy, you'll never find out about your parents. Who they were, why you wound up being dumped into those alleys where I found you." Han stared at Shrike. "You know who they were? You know why I was abandoned?" He swallowed, and it was searing pain. Tell me, and I may let you live. Shrike was almost within grabbing distance of the blaster now. Only a meter or so away. Han knew he should shoot him, knew Shrike couldn't be trusted, but still he hesitated. Tell me, Shrike! I'll tell you everything when you give me the blaster, Shrike said. Everything. You have my word. Shoot him. Now. Han's mind screamed. With a wash of red light, a blaster bolt struck garish Shrike directly in the chest. The captain threw up his hands, a look of terror and pain contorting his features. He fell backward like a stone, dead before he hit the permacrete. Han stared wildly at his hand. His finger was on the trigger of the blaster, but he hadn't moved it, had he? The shot, he realized, a second later, had come from behind him. Han whirled, still on his knees, to find himself facing another man. He was human, young, medium tall, slender build. Darkish hair frosted by moonlight. He held a drawn blaster, and every line of him screamed, "Bounty hunter!" "Okay, kid, it's over," he said, removing a pair of wrist binders from his belt. "Stand up. You're coming with me." Those first two shots, Han thought. It must have been him. He followed me up here, and just waited for Shrike to take me down, so he could step in and get me. As if he'd sensed what Han was thinking, the bounty hunter added, "I knew old Shrike would find you. The Huts don't have a picture of you, so I followed Shrike, 'cause he practically raised you, didn't he, VYKK? I knew he'd pick you out for me." "No!" Han's mind screamed. "Not now. Not again." He was still stiff from the paralysis, exhausted and hurt from the fight with Shrike. Every muscle screamed with pain and weariness. The bounty hunter gestured with the blaster. "Drop your blaster, kid, or I'll stun you right in the head and scramble your brains good. The Huts want you alive, but they didn't say nothing about in your right mind. Drop it." Shaking, Han dropped the blaster from his nerveless fingers. With a grunt of effort, he tried to get up, but his right leg buckled beneath him. "My leg," he mumbled. "Right leg won't take my weight. Shrike kicked me." "Yeah, I saw him." Not very professional of him, but old Shrike always was hot-tempered, the bounty hunter said. Moving forward, he added, "Now I'm going to give you a hand up. Don't try." With a demented howl, Han hurled himself headfirst into the bounty hunter's midsection. This man was younger than Shrike, stronger and faster. But Han was fighting like a man, with the strength born of utter desperation. He had nothing to lose, and he knew it. The bounty hunter went over backward with a yell of surprise. Han threw himself after him, pummeling the man. Recovering himself, the bounty hunter slammed Han across the temple with the muzzle of his blaster. Blood spurted, ran into Han's left eye, but the Corellian didn't let it slow him down. He clawed his way up the other's body as though it were a jungle vine and headed the bounty hunter, slamming his forehead into the man's nose. Han heard and felt cartilage break against the bone of his skull. The man's shrill scream rang through the night. Cursing, the bounty hunter grappled with Han, slamming him on the back and in the kidneys with the blaster. Han grabbed his arm and slammed his hand against the permacrete. Wham! Wham! The blaster dropped from the man's fingers. Han butted the bounty hunter in the face again, ignoring the splitting of his own skin. "You're not taking me!" The Corellian yelled, slamming his head into the man's face repeatedly. With a yell of terror, the bounty hunter heaved upward with all his strength and sent Han flying. The Corellian hit, tried to roll, and slammed up against the structure that housed the turbolift. The bounty hunter, his face a gory mask from his broken nose and split lips, rushed for Han, murder in his eyes. Han waited until the last possible second, then dodged. As the man went by, Han slammed his full weight into the other's shoulder. The bounty hunter's head impacted with the stone structure with a crack that seemed to echo throughout the icy night. The man jerked, went limp, then slid down the wall, to lie motionless on the permacrete. Weaving, biting his lip, and swallowing bile, Han lurched to his feet and stumbled over to the man. 2 fingers against his throat assured the Corellian that the bounty hunter was now as dead as Garrus Shrike, who was lying sprawled a few meters away, staring up at the twin moons with blank, sightless eyes. Han slid down the wall in his own turn and just sat there, his head whirling, sick and exhausted. He began to shake all over, and the bout lasted for nearly a minute. Gotta get hold of myself, he thought dully. Gotta think. Think. Climbing back to his feet, Han staggered over to the bounty hunter again and stood eyeing him. The man was about his own size, and he, too, had brown hair. Darker than Han's own, but that might not be noticed. Han's breath puffed white as he yanked on the man's boots, pulling them off. Slowly, methodically, he set about stripping the bounty hunter. 5 minutes later, Han stood swaying, dressed now in the bounty hunter's clothing. Grimly, he began putting his own clothes onto the corpse, his worn gray pilot's jumpsuit, his battered lizard skin jacket, his boots. He replaced the bounty hunter's blaster in his holster. Lastly, he took a handful of credits, and all of his faked IDs, and placed them in the man's inside pocket, sealing the pocket shut. Then he sealed the jacket closed, too. Stumbling and limping, Han went looking for Shrike's blaster. He found it, finally, and went back to the body. Wincing, he adjusted it to its highest setting, aimed the weapon, then, turning his head to the side, he fired directly into the corpse's face. When he forced himself to look, the dead man no longer had a face, or eyes, or retinas. Han staggered away a few feet and was thoroughly, wretchedly, sick. The thought of what that meal had cost him made him even sicker. With a groan of effort, he grabbed the body beneath the arms and dragged the bounty hunter across the icy permacrete, just as Shrike had dragged him. He went backwards slowly, carefully, until he was once again beside that deep, deep air shaft that he jumped. Han peered down, then looked away quickly, fighting dizziness. The shaft went down a long, long way. He rolled the body to the edge, then, with a hard push of both hands, sent the bounty hunter over the edge, tumbling out into empty air. Han didn't watch the body fall. With dragging, limping steps, he lurched back to Shrike's body and placed the captain's blaster in the dead fingers. Then he pressed a button to summon the turbolift. When the doors opened, he nearly fell into the lighted interior. The turbolift started down, and Han stood swaying, bracing himself with both hands. He had to work at not passing out. It had been a long night. Han Solo stood alone amid the teeming mass of cadets gathered at the rooftop landing field on Coruscant. The tight collar of his new uniform chafed his neck, but he resisted the urge to tug at it. Doing so might wrinkle it, and Han wanted to look his best. All around him, cadets were being hugged and kissed farewell by their families. Only a few cadets were alone, as he was. Han scanned the crowd and noticed a dark-skinned boy a few meters away, who didn't seem to have anybody. And there was a young woman with military short hair standing across the landing field who was also alone. But most of the cadets had fathers, and mothers, brothers and sisters and grandparents, uncles and aunts and cousins, who'd come to see them off in their hour of triumph. Han felt a wave of loneliness. He was older than the other cadets, and that too set him apart. But hey, I'm here. I made it. The transport Imperator lay waiting for them on the landing field. Soon, the cadets would be boarding it for their trip to Karita, the Imperial military training world. Han smiled a little as he studied its lines, its oversized dorsal fin. A Karelian corvette. How fitting. He gazed at the crowd again, searchingly, and suddenly realized that he'd been hoping to see a certain red-gold head among the well-wishers. Dumb, Solo. Really dumb. You didn't really expect her to show up, did you? She's long gone. No, Han decided, he really hadn't expected Bria to show up. But maybe, deep down, he'd hoped she would. He sighed. Delana had used to quote an old Wookiee proverb at him, something that translated into basic as, roughly, joy unmixed with sorrow is suspect. Delana. If only she could see him now. Han imagined her, her tall, shaggy form, her snub black nose, her little, twinkling eyes nearly hidden beneath tufts of graying tan Wookiee hair. She would be very proud today, he knew that. For a moment she was so real that he could almost imagine her, could almost hear her growls and moans as she told him how proud he'd made her. She'd ruffle up his hair so he'd look attractively scruffy. Han smiled faintly at the idea. I made it, Delana, he told her image silently. Look at me. You're my family, my only family, so it's right that you be here today, even if you're only in my memory. And Bria. Face it, Solo, you still care. You still watch for her, and listen for the sound of her step, her voice. You need to get over this, man. Han shook his head, as though he could dismiss Bria's image as easily as he'd summoned Delana's. But he was taking Bria aboard the Imperator, as surely as if she were here, walking beside him. No matter how he tried, he couldn't forget her. Another of Delana's old Wookiee proverbs surfaced in his mind. To have a good memory is to be both blessed and cursed. How right you are, Delana, Han thought. He shifted his weight, and stabbing pain in his right leg reminded him of the fight the night before last. Han blew out his breath. He's dead, Delana, he thought. Your killer is dead. You can rest easier, knowing that, I'll bet. An Imperial officer was making his way through the crowd, now. As he passed Han, the lieutenant paused and looked at him sharply. Your name, Cadet? Han snapped to attention. Cadet Han Solo, sir. You forget how to salute, Cadet Solo? No, sir. Han said, and gave the man his best salute. The officer gazed at Han's face. Cadet Solo, what happened to your face? For a moment Han was tempted to say he walked into a door, but he decided that the truth was probably the best answer. Sir, I got in a fight. Really? I could never have told. The lieutenant said, a tinge of sarcasm in his voice. What was the fight about, Cadet Solo? Han thought fast. My opponent insulted the Imperial Navy, sir. After all, it was true. The lieutenant raised an eyebrow. Really, Cadet? That was most unwise of him. Did you give him a good thrashing for his disrespect, Cadet Solo? Han remembered just in time not to nod. I did, sir. I assure the lieutenant that he will never say anything insulting about the Imperial forces again, sir. Very good, Cadet Solo. The lieutenant smiled faintly and walked on, to the head of the group. Han breathed a long, slow sigh of relief. Made it through that one. An amplified voice echoed across the landing fields. A non-commissioned officer was standing beside the lieutenant, giving orders. Imperial cadets! Assemble in ranks. There was general confusion for a second, then the lines of cadets formed into ranks. We will board the transport ship in rows, No talking, and pick up your feet." Silence fell. Han was in row 4. He stood as straight as he could, looking neither left nor right, waiting for his orders to move. From somewhere, the martial theme of the Imperial Navy began playing in the background. Row 1. March. Row 2. March. Row 3. March. Excitement coursed through Han, singing in his blood, "This is it. What I've waited for all my life." Row 4. March. Bawled the non-com. Han right-faced smartly, and followed the man ahead of him toward the Imperator. As he marched, he allowed himself a faint smile. Today it begins, he thought. My real life begins. He imagined Delana's and Bria's faces. They were smiling, too. His feet were on the ramp. Han took a deep breath, the kind of breath that a newborn might draw in order to give its first cry, its first shout of, "I'm here. Listen to me, I'm alive." Han Solo felt new, as though he'd just been born. The dark past tumbled off his shoulders, and only the bright future lay ahead. He marched forward into it eagerly, and did not look back. About the author. A.C. Crispin is the author of the best-selling Han Solo trilogy. Her newest project is a prequel to the Disney Pirates of the Caribbean films. Pirates of the Caribbean: The Price of Freedom focuses on Jack Sparrow's early life, and will be released May 17, 2011. Ms. Crispin writes in her own universes, including her 7-book Starbridge series, and Storms of Destiny, the first novel in a planned trilogy. She's also created stories in other media universes, including Star Trek, V, and Alien. Crispin is active in Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, and serves as the chair of Writer Beware, SFWA's scam watchdog volunteer group. www.writerbeware.com. And Crispin is married to SF writer Michael Capobianco and lives in Maryland. Learn more about her current projects by visiting her website, www.accrispin.com. By A.C. Crispin. Star Wars: The Han Solo Trilogy. The Paradise Snare. The Hutt Gambit. Rebel Dawn. Fantasy. Griffin's Eyrie, with Andre Norton. Songsmith, with Andre Norton. Star Trek. Yesterday's Sun. Time for Yesterday. The Eyes of the Beholders. Sarek. Science Fiction. The Starbridge series, books 1 to 7. The Exiles of Bakurain. Storms of Destiny. Winds of Vengeance. Flames of Chaos. Pirates of the Caribbean: The Price of Freedom. Star Wars: The Expanded Universe. You saw the movies. You watched the cartoon series, or maybe played some of the video games. But did you know? In The Empire Strikes Back, Princess Leia Organa said to Han Solo, "I love you." Han said, "I know. But did you know that they actually got married? And had 3 Jedi children, the twins, Jason and Jaina, and a younger son, Anakin?" Luke Skywalker was trained as a Jedi by Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda. But did you know that, years later, he went on to revive the Jedi Order and its commitment to defending the galaxy from evil and injustice? Obi-Wan said to Luke, "For over 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic. Before the Dark Times. Before the Empire. Did you know that over those millennia, legendary Jedi and infamous Sith Lords were adding their names to the annals of Republic history?" Yoda explained that the dreaded Sith tend to come in twos. Always two there are. No more, no less. A master and an apprentice. But did you know that the Sith didn't always exist in pairs? That at one time in the ancient Republic there were as many Sith as Jedi, until a Sith Lord named Darth Bane was the lone survivor of a great Sith war and created the Rule of Two. All this and much, much more is brought to life in the many novels and comics of the Star Wars expanded universe. You've seen the movies and watched the cartoon. Now venture out into the wider worlds of Star Wars. Turn the page or jump to the timeline of Star Wars novels to learn more. Han Solo, former Imperial officer, sat despondently at a sticky table in a dingy bar on Devarin, sipping an inferior Alderaanian ale and wishing he were alone. Not that he minded the other denizens of the bar, horned Devish males and furry Devish females, plus a smattering of non-humans from other worlds. Han was used to aliens. He'd grown up with them aboard Trader's Luck, a large trading ship that wandered the space lanes of the galaxy. By the time he was 10, Han had been able to speak and understand half a dozen non-human languages. No, it wasn't the aliens around him. It was the alien beside him. Han took a swig of his ale, grimaced at the sour taste, then glanced sidelong at the cause of all his troubles. The huge, hairy being gazed back at him with concerned blue eyes. Han sighed heavily. If only he'd go home. But the Wookiee, chew something, utterly refused to go home to Kashyyyk, despite Han's repeated urging. The alien claimed he owed something called a life debt to former Imperial Lieutenant Han Solo. Life debt, great. Just what I need, Han thought bitterly. A big furry nursemaid trailing after me, giving me advice, fussing over me if I drink too much, telling me he's gonna take care of me. Great. Just great. Han scowled into his ale, and the pale, watery brew reflected his countenance back at him, distorting his features until he appeared nearly as alien as the Wookiee. What was his name? Chew something. The Wookiee had told him, but Han wasn't good at pronouncing Wookiee, even though he understood it perfectly. Besides, he didn't want to learn this particular Wookiee's name. If he learned his name, he'd likely never get rid of his hairy shadow. Han rubbed a hand over his face blearily, feeling several days' stubble. Ever since he'd been kicked out of the service, he kept forgetting to shave. When he'd been a cadet, then a junior lieutenant, then a full lieutenant, he'd been meticulous with his grooming, the way an officer and a gentleman should be, but now, what difference did it make? Han raised his glass in a slightly unsteady hand and gulped the sour ale. He put the empty tankard down, and glanced around the bar for the server. Need another drink. One more, and I'll feel much better. Just one more. The Wookiee moaned quietly. Han's scowl deepened. Keep your opinions to yourself, hairball, he snarled. I'll know when I've had enough. Last thing I need is a Wookiee playing nursemaid for me. The Wookiee, Chewbacca, that was it, growled softly, his blue eyes shadowed with concern. Han's lip curled. I'm perfectly capable of looking after myself, and don't you forget it. Just 'cause I saved your furry but from being vaporized doesn't mean you owe me a thing. I told you before, I owed a Wookiee long ago. Owed her my life, couple times over. So I saved you, 'cause I owed her. Chewbacca made a sound halfway between a moan and a snarl. Han shook his head. No, that means you don't owe me a thing, don't you get it? I owed her, but I couldn't repay her. So I helped you out, which makes us even, square. So will you please take those credits I gave you, and go back to Kashyyyk? You ain't doing me any favors staying here, hairball. I need you like I need a blaster burn on my butt. Affronted, Chewbacca drew himself up to his full Wookiee height. He growled low in his throat. Yeah, I know I tossed away my career and my living that day on Coruscant when I stopped Commander Nicholas from shooting you. I hate slavery, and watching Nicholas use a force whip ain't a particularly appetizing sight. I know Wookiees, you see. When I was growing up, a Wookiee was my best friend. I knew you were gonna turn on Nicholas before you did it, just like I knew Nicholas would go for his blaster. I couldn't just stand there and watch him blast you. But don't go trying to make me out as some kinda hero, Chewie. I don't need a partner, and I don't want a friend. My name says it all, pal. Solo. Han jerked a thumb at his chest. Solo. In my language, that means me, alone, by myself. Get it? That's the way it is, and that's the way I like it. So, no offense, Chewie, but why don't you just scram? As in, go away. Permanently. Chewie stared at Han for a long moment, then he snorted disdainfully, turned, and strode out of the bar. Han wondered disinterestedly if he'd actually managed to convince the big hairy oaf to leave for good. If he had, that was reason for celebration. For another drink. As he glanced around the bar, he saw that over in the corner several patrons were gathering around a table. A sabacc game was forming. Han wondered whether he ought to try to get in on it. Mentally he reviewed the contents of his credit pouch, and decided that might not be a bad idea. He usually had very good luck at sabacc, and every credit counted these days. These days? Han sighed. How long had it been since that fateful day when he'd been sent to assist Commander Nicholas with the crew of Wookiee laborers assigned to complete a new wing on the Imperial Hall of Heroes? He counted, grimacing as he realized that he'd lost days on end in there, days probably spent in a dark haze of ale and bitter recrimination. In 2 days it would be 2 months. Han's mouth tightened and he ran an unsteady hand through his unruly brown hair. For the past 5 years he'd kept it cut short in approved military fashion, but now it was growing out, getting almost shaggy. He had a sudden, sharp mental image of himself as he'd been then, immaculately groomed, insignia polished, boots shining, and glanced down at himself. What a contrast between then and now. He was wearing a stained, grayish shirt that had once been white, a stained, gray knee-leather jacket he'd purchased second-hand, and dark blue military-style trousers with his Corellian blood stripe running down the outside seam. Only the boots were the same. They were custom-fitted when each cadet was commissioned, so the Empire hadn't wanted them back. Han had been commissioned just a little over 8 months ago, and no junior lieutenant had ever been prouder of his rank, or of those shining boots. The boots were scuffed now, and worn. Han's lip curled as he regarded them. Scuffed and worn by life, all the spit and polish gone, that about described him these days, too. In a moment of painful honesty, Han admitted that he probably wouldn't have been able to stay in the Imperial Navy even if he hadn't gotten himself cashiered for rescuing and freeing Chewbacca. He'd started his career with high hopes, but disillusionment had quickly set in. The prejudice against non-humans had been hard to take for someone raised the way Han had been, but he'd bitten his tongue and remained silent. But the endless, silly bureaucratic regs, the blind stupidity of so many of the officers, Han had already begun to wonder how long he'd be able to take it. But he'd never figured on a dishonorable discharge, loss of pension and back pay, and, worst of all, being blacklisted as a pilot. They hadn't taken his license, but Han had quickly discovered that no legitimate company would hire him. He tramped the permacrete of Coruscant for weeks, in between alcoholic binges, looking for work, and found all respectable doors closed to him. Then, one night, as he tavern hopped in a section of the planet-wide city near the alien ghetto, a huge, furred shadow had flowed out of the deeper shadows of an alley and confronted Han. For long moments Han's ale-fogged brain hadn't even recognized the Wookiee as the one he'd saved. It was only when Chewbacca began speaking, thanking Han for saving his life and freeing him from slavery, that Han had realized who he was. Chewie had been quite direct. His people didn't mince words. He, Chewbacca, had sworn a life debt to Han Solo. Where Han went, from that day forward he would go, too. And he had. When Han had finally gotten them passage off Coruscant, piloting a ship with a load of contraband to Trailus, the cargo had been magnetically sealed into the hold. Han hadn't had the equipment, or the energy to break in and find out exactly what it was he was smuggling. Chewbacca had gone with him. On the week-long voyage, Han began teaching the Wookiee the rudiments of piloting. Space travel was boring, and at least that gave him something to do besides brood over lost futures. Once on Trailus, he turned over his ship and cargo, then went looking for another assignment. He wound up at truthful Toro's used spaceship lot, asking the Duros for work. Toro was an old acquaintance, and he knew Han was a reliable and expert pilot. The Empire was tightening its grip all the time, taking away the rights of its worlds as well as its citizens. Duro had a shipbuilding industry nearly equal to that of Corellia, but they had recently been prohibited by Imperial directive from placing weapons systems in their ships. Han's clandestine cargo proved to be a shipment of components useful in outfitting ships with weapons. By the time they reached Duro, Chewie was becoming a fair co-pilot and gunner. Han hoped that teaching the Wookiee these skills would make it easier to get rid of him on some world. If he knew the Wookiee could hire on as a skilled pilot or co-pilot, he wouldn't hesitate to dump him in some port and then lift ship, or so Han told himself. Once on Duro, Han drank up some of the profits from his mission, while waiting to be contacted for another piloting job. His patience was rewarded one day when a Celestin approached him and offered him good pay to take a ship from Duro, avoiding any Imperial ports of call, a third of the way across the galaxy to Kothlas, a Bot-Han colony world. Of course the sleek, swift little craft was stolen from some wealthy owner's landing pad. Han had to remind himself that he was no longer in the business of keeping the law. He was in the business of breaking it. So he set his jaw and piloted the stolen vessel to her new home on Kothlas. Then he went looking for another assignment, and eventually found one. On the surface, this job seemed legit. Han was to ferry a large Nalargon from Kothlas to Deveran. Han had never heard of a Nalargon before, which wasn't surprising, as his exposure to music had been limited. A Nalargon proved to be a very large instrument that was operated by a keyboard and foot pedals. Pipes and subharmonic resonance generators produced sound on many wave bands. The instruments were in demand for the jizz craze that was sweeping the galaxy. Accordingly, the huge instrument was brought aboard the ship Han had been assigned, bolted to the deck, then left sealed in the cargo compartment. Han investigated the instrument once he and Chewie were safely in hyperspace. He tapped it, poked and nudged it, turned it on, then tried pressing the keys and pedals. No sound, except the sound he made trying to make it work. But his tappings proved it wasn't hollow. Han sat back on his heels, gazing at the huge instrument. The thing was obviously a dummy. A shell, with something inside. What? Han knew from his stint in the Imperial Navy that Deveran was a world in turmoil. Not long ago a group of rebels had risen against the Imperial governor, demanding independence from the Empire. Han's lip curled disdainfully. Stupid fools, thinking they had a chance against the Empire. 700 of the rebels had been captured when the ancient holy city of Montelian Sarat had been overrun by Imperial troops a few months ago. They'd been summarily executed without trial, killed without mercy. The remaining rebels were still hiding out in the hills, holding out, attacking commando fashion, but Han knew it was only a matter of time before they, too, would be ground beneath Palpatine's heel, their world rigidly controlled by the Empire, as so many other worlds had been. Eyeing the Nalargon, Han made some mental calculations based on the instrument being hollow. Yeah, a short-bore mobile laser cannon would just about fit inside that shell. The weapon could be mounted on the back of a land skimmer, and was capable of blowing small targets, a building, or a short-range Imperial fighter, into very small pieces. It could also be blast rifles, of course. 10 or 15 would fit inside there, if they were cleverly packed. Whatever was inside the Nalagan, Han had a bad feeling about the assignment he'd taken on. He resolved to land the ship, then walk away from it and not go back. He had fake landing codes provided by the Bahans. He'd use them, and then get away as quickly as he could. He'd landed yesterday, and for all Han knew, the ship was still sitting on the field with the Nalagan in her cargo hold. But he had a hunch that the rebels on Deveran hadn't wasted any time. Han shook his head a little blearily, half wishing he hadn't had that last ale. The sour taste was still in his mouth, and his head buzzed. Han looked from side to side, testingly, and the room stayed still. Good. He wasn't too drunk to play sabacc and win. Let's get on with it, Solo. Every little credit helps. The smuggler rose to his feet and strolled quite steadily across the room to the table. Greetings, gentles, he said in basic. Got room for another player? The dealer, a Deveronian male, turned his head with its waxed, polished horns to regard Han questioningly. He must have decided that the newcomer looked okay, because he shrugged and gestured at the vacant seat. Welcome, pilot. As long as your credits hold out, so does your welcome. He grinned, showing sharp, feral teeth. Han nodded, then slid into the seat. He'd first learned to play sabacc when he was about 14. Han emptied credits into the high-stakes pot, the sabacc pot, then picked up the 2 cards he'd been dealt and scanned them, all the while covertly studying his opponents. When the bet for the hand pot came round to him, he tossed the requisite number of credit discs into that pot, too. Han had the 6 of staves and the Queen of Air and Darkness, but at any moment the dealer could push a button, and all the card values would change. Han eyed his opponents, a tiny Celestin, a furry Deveronian female, the Deveronian male dealer, and a huge female variable, a reptilide being from Barab 1. This was the first time Han had seen a variable up close, and she was an impressive sight. Over 2 meters tall, covered with tough black scales that would repel even a stun blast, the variable had a mouthful of dagger-like teeth and a club-like tail that reportedly made them nasty customers in a fight. This one, who had introduced herself as Shalimar, seemed peaceful enough though. She picked up the newest card chip she'd been dealt and studied her hand intently through narrowed slit-pupilled eyes. The object of sabacc was to get cards to equal, but not exceed, the number 23, either positive or negative. In case of a tie, positive totals beat negatives. At the moment the cards in Han's hand had a numerical value of positive 4. The Queen of Air and Darkness had a value of -2. Han could throw that card into the interference field, which would freeze its value, then hope to get the idiot and a card with the face value of 3. Since the idiot had a value of 0, this would give him an idiot's array, which would beat even a pure sabacc, that is, cards whose value added up to either positive or negative 23. As Han hesitated, gazing at his queen, the card chips rippled and altered. His queen was now the master of sabers. The 6 of sabers had become the 8 of flasks. His total was positive 22. He waited while the other players examined their card chips. The variable, the female Deveronian, and the dealer threw in their hands disgustedly. They'd bombed out by exceeding 23. The Celestin raised the bet, which Han matched and raised. I call, the little alien said, laying down his card chips with a flourish. 20, he announced. Han grinned and put down his own. 22, he announced casually, laying down his own hand. Afraid that hand pot's mine, pal. The other players grumbled a bit as he scooped up their money. The variable female hissed and gave him a look that could have melted titanium, but said nothing. The Celestin took the next hand, and the Deveronian dealer the one that followed. Han eyed the growing sabak pot, and decided to try to go for the bigger payoff. They continued to play for several more hands. Han won the hand pot again, but nobody had gotten the sabak pot. Han tossed the 3 of coins and the idiot into the interference field, and his luck held. The very next change of cards left him holding the 2 of flasks. Idiot's array, Han said casually, tossing the 2 down next to the other 2 cards in the interference field. The sabak pot is mine, ladies and gentlemen. He bent forward to scoop up the pot, and the variable female let out a roar. Cheater! He's got a skifter, he must have. No one can be so lucky. Han sat back and stared at her, outraged. He had cheated at sabak plenty of times, using skifters, cards that would assume different values when their edges were tapped, and in other ways. But this time he'd won fair and square. You can take your accusations and stick 'em in your ear. The Corellian burst out indignantly. Of course the variable didn't have any visible ears, but his meaning wasn't lost on her. Dropping his right hand down to his thigh, he silently unsnapped the strap on the top of his holster. Shaking his head vehemently, he added, I wasn't cheating. You were just outplayed, sister. Left-handed, Han reached across the table, grabbed a fistful of credits, and stuffed them into his pocket. Nobody moved or spoke, so he reached for the remaining handful. In a blur of reddish fur, the Deveronian female's hand shot out, grabbed his wrist, and pinned it to the table. Maybe Shalimar is right, she said, in strongly accented basic. We should search him to make sure. Han glared at her. Take your hands off me, he said very quietly. Or I'll make you really sorry. Something in his eyes and voice must have impressed her, because she let go of him and stepped back. Coward! Shalimar snarled at the Deveronian. He's just a puny human. The Deveronian shook her head and backed away, indicating that she wanted no further part in the conflict. Han smiled smugly as he reached for the last of the card chips. Seeing that smile, the variable roared again. One armored, sharp-taloned hand came sweeping down in a mighty blow that smashed the table in 2, sending board, credits, and card chips flying. Snarling, she advanced on Han. No! I'm going to bite your head off, cheater. We'll see how good you are then. Han took one look at her gaping maw, realizing that she was big enough to make good on her threat, and went for his blaster. His right hand dropped to his thigh with blurring speed, then the well-worn grip was there, nestled against his palm. His hand, still moving with extraordinary speed, started back up as he began his draw. Only to stop short when the blaster hung up in the holster. Han had barely a second to realize that the blaster's front sight, mounted on the end of the barrel, was caught at the bottom of his holster. He tugged, trying to free his weapon. The variable leaped for him. Han jumped back, but not far enough. Shalimar's huge, sharp talons grabbed the front of his jacket, slashing the tough material as though it were tissue. Still yanking at his trapped blaster, Han was hauled toward the Barabel's wide-open mouth so fast his vision blurred. He let out a choked gasp as a blast of hot, reeking reptiloid breath engulfed him. Suddenly Han glimpsed a blur of brownish tan at the corner of his vision, just as a huge roar nearly deafened him. A long, furred arm snaked around Shalimar's neck, jerking her back, away from Han. Chewie! Han yelled. He'd never been so glad to see someone in his life. The Variable roared back at the Wookiee, dropping the Corellian as she swung around to grapple with her attacker. "Hold her for a second, Chewie!" Han yelled, yanking at the bottom of his holster as he twisted the grip of his blaster. At last! He pulled it up and sighted at the Variable as she wrestled with the Wookiee, but he couldn't get a clear shot. The two huge beings, snarling and hissing, rampaged across the room, knocking over tables and chairs. The other sabacc players and denizens of the bar scattered before the fray, screaming advice and curses in multiple languages. The Celestin sabacc player dropped his hand to his own blaster, but when he saw that Han was now armed, he turned and flung himself behind the bar. Shalimar and Chewbacca swayed back and forth, locked in a grim parody of a loving embrace, each testing the other's strength, trying to get each other off balance. "Chewie, come on!" Han yelled. "Let's get out of here!" Chewbacca and Shalimar whirled in a blur of brown fur and black scales. Then Shalimar lowered her head and snapped at the Wookiee's arm. Her needle-sharp teeth sheared off a chunk of fur and meat. The Wookiee roared in agony and, with a burst of strength, grabbed the Barabel's arm and slung her around with dizzying speed, so fast that her feet slid out from under her. As she went down, Chewie also grabbed her tail, swinging her so hard she was airborne. With a final howl of triumph, Chewbacca released his grip and sent the huge reptiloid flying across the room, while sentients scattered to avoid her trajectory. Shalimar landed on her back amid a ruin of chairs, tables, and sabacc card chips. "Stun won't work, don't want to kill." A jumble of thoughts raced through Han's mind as he thumbed the setting on the blaster, aimed, and fired at the dazed Shalimar, hitting her at half force just below one huge knee joint. She hissed in pain and sagged back, black scales smoking and steaming. "Chewie, come on!" Han yelled, snapping off a stun shot at the sabacc dealer, who was aiming a blaster at the Wookiee. The Devaronian went down without a sound. Chewie, dripping blood, was right behind Han as they raced for the exit, knocking over chairs and tables. The tavern's owner, a Devaronian female, blocked his way, screaming curses and threats, but Han slapped her aside with the barrel of his blaster and kept running. He slammed the door with his shoulder, then bounced off. Locked. Swearing in 6 non-human languages, Han thumbed the indicator on his weapon up to its highest power, and blasted the door. The proprietor howled in protest, but the Corellian and the Wookiee were already gone. Han and Chewbacca pelted down the squalid alley, then swung out onto the street with its rustic-looking buildings made of blue native wood and stuccoed permacrete. A chilly breeze made the Corellian shiver. It was early spring here on Devron's south polar continent. Han quickly holstered his blaster as he dropped his pace to a fast walk. "How's the arm, pal?" Chewie groaned, ending in a snarl. Han glanced down at the damage. "Well, it was your choice to come back," he pointed out. "Not that I'm sorry you did, mind you. I want to say, thanks for saving my rear." The Wookiee made an interrogatory sound. Han shrugged. "Well, sure, I guess," he mumbled. "I've never had a partner before, but yeah, why not? It can get kinda boring on long space flights without someone to talk to, I guess." Chewie rumbled with satisfaction, despite his pain. "Don't push your luck," Han said dryly. "Listen, we got to get that arm seen to. There's a med droids clinic across the street. Let's go." An hour later the two were back on the street. Chewie's arm, after a back-to-treatment, was sheathed in a protective bandage, but the med droid had assured them that Wookiees were quick healers. The Wookiee had just finished commenting that he was hungry, when Han heard a soft call from the shelter of a nearby doorway. "Pilot Solo." Han stopped in his tracks and looked over to find a Duros male beckoning to him. He glanced from side to side, but the Deveronian street scene was quiet and peaceful. This section near the town square was reserved for pedestrian traffic. Yeah? He replied, in a low voice. The blue-skinned Duros motioned for Han to follow him into a nearby alley. The Corellian walked to the mouth, turned the corner, then stood with his back against the wall, hand on the grip of his blaster. Okay, this is as far as I go without knowing what you want. The Duro's mournful expression lengthened even farther. You are not a trusting sentient, Pilot Solo. I was referred to you by a mutual friend, Truthful Toril. He said you are an excellent pilot. Han relaxed slightly, but didn't take his hand off his gun. I'm good, all right, he said. If Truthful Toril sent you, prove it. The Duros gazed straight at him with calm, moonstone-colored eyes. He said I was to tell you that the talisman you brought him is no more. Han relaxed and took his hand off his weapon. Okay, you've convinced me he sent you, he said. State your business. I need a ship delivered to Nar Heka, in the Hutt system, the Duros said. I am willing to pay well, but Pilot Solo, you must not allow Imperials to board her should you run into any patrols. Han sighed. More intrigues. But the Duros' offer interested him. He'd been planning all along to eventually make his way to Nar Shada, the smuggler's moon that orbited Nar Huta. Now would be as good a time as any. From Nar Heka, he could easily catch a ship to Nar Huta or Nar Shada. Tell me more, he said. Only if you can raise ship within 2 hours, the Duros said. If not, tell me, and I will look elsewhere for a pilot. Han considered for a moment. Well, I could maybe change my plans for the right price. The Duros named a figure, then added, and the same sum upon delivery. Han snorted, then shook his head, though inwardly he was surprised at how high the initial bid was. Come on, Chui, he said. We've got places to go, people to see. Too quickly, the Duros named another, higher sum. This guy must really be desperate, Han thought as he pretended to hesitate for a beat. He shook his head. I dunno, it's not worth mine, but if the Imperials are looking for this ship of yours. What's she carrying? The Duros' expression did not change. That I cannot tell you. But I will tell you that if you deliver the ship and its contents safely to Tacta the Hutt, he will be pleased, and pleasing a Hutt lord is generally considered to be a good thing for one's financial well-being. Tacta is Juliak the Hutt's highest-ranking subordinate on Nar Heka. Han's ears pricked up. Juliak the Hutt was a very high-ranking Hutt lord indeed. Maybe this Tacta would give him a recommendation to the boss. Han scratched his head, then named a sum. And all in advance, he added. The Duros' pale blue skin seemed to grow even paler, but then he nodded. Very well as to the sum, but half up front. You will receive the rest from Tacta, Pilot Solo. Han considered, then nodded. Okay, you've got yourself a deal. Chui. He turned to address the Wookiee, who was hovering nearby, listening intently. Go on back to that lockbox where we left our stuff and get it, will you, while I conclude my business with our friend here? The Wookiee rumbled a soft assent. Thanks. I'll meet you on the north side of the town square in an hour, okay? Chewbacca nodded and moved off down the street. Han walked closer to the Duros and said, Okay, you've got yourself a pilot. We'll raise ship within 2 hours. Fill me in on the rest of it. Where do I find this Tacta the Hutt? Within minutes Han had all the details. The Duros handed over a sheaf of credit vouchers, gave him the ship's security code, and the location of the vessel. Then the blue-skinned alien melted away into the dimness of the alley. Han had a couple of minutes to kill, so he grabbed a quick bite at the cafe next door. He had to argue with the devish female chef to get her to cook his meat. But it was worth it. The food drowned the last of the ale-induced muzziness. Clear-headed, his energy renewed, Han felt considerably cheered. On his way to the town square, he stopped off at a second-hand shop that catered to spacers of all species. There he bought a beat-up black lizard-hide jacket to replace the one the variable had shredded. Respectably clothed again, he started up the street toward his rendezvous with Chewbacca. Han knew something was up long before he reached the town square. The sound of a huge crowd was unmistakable. They seemed to be shouting in unison. The skin at the back of Han's neck prickled suddenly as he realized that there was something familiar about those words. They weren't in Basic, but he'd heard those simple, repetitious phrases before. But where? I've got a bad feeling about this, he thought, turning the corner and seeing the crowd. They were chanting. Chanting, swaying, rocking with religious fervor. Mostly Deveronians, of course, but there were a smattering of humans and other sentients. Han's gaze raked the crowd, following it to the front. A hastily erected dais stood there, and atop it, leading the revival, stood a figure out of Han's past. Oh no! He thought. This is the Ilesian revival, and that missionary is Veritil. I can't let him see me. 5 years ago, Han had spent almost 6 months on the steaming, fungus-infested world of Ilesia. He'd been working as a pilot before taking the examinations to get into the academy, practicing and honing his piloting skills. Ilesia was a world at the edge of Hutt space, where a race of beings called the Tlandil, distant cousins of the Hutts, offered pilgrims, supposed religious sanctuary. The Tlandil sent missionaries to many worlds to preach about the One and the All. Han had known that for years, but he'd never been unlucky enough to run into an Ilesian revival before now. For a wild moment the Corellian wanted to draw his blaster, shoot Veritil down, and yell to the assembled crowd of potential pilgrims, "Go home! It's all a big fake. They just want you so they can enslave you, you fools. Get out of here." But how could he make them believe him? To most sentients in the galaxy, Ilesia was perceived as a place of religious retreat, where the faithful gathered, and those wishing to hide from their pasts could find sanctuary. The fact that the Ilesian sanctuary would turn out to be a trap was known only to the lucky few, like Han, who'd managed to escape. No doubt Veritil had a transport standing by to load the pilgrims on board. Unfortunate sentients who followed him would have no idea that their voyage to Ilesia would lead only to slavery in the spice factories. Then, when they grew too weak or sick to work, they'd face death in the spice mines of Kessel. Ilesia was a golden dream for the faithful, but the reality was a world of bondage and unending toil. Teroenza, Veritil's boss, was the high priest of Ilesia. Before fleeing the colony, Han had robbed the Tlandil leader of the most valuable pieces in a rare and extensive collection. He'd left Teroenza wounded, but alive. Han had escaped Ilesia in Teroenza's personal yacht, the Talisman. Soon after his getaway, Han discovered that the Tlandil and their Hutt overlords had placed a fat bounty on the head of Vykkk Drago, Han's alias. Han had to change his identity, even his retinal patterns, to escape detection and capture. Now, seeing Veritil, Han ducked his head and turned away, wishing he had a hood he could pull up to hide his face. If the Sacerdot saw him and recognized him, Han knew that he was in for it. The chanting surrounding him intensified. Han began to sweat, despite the chill of the Deveronian weather, because he knew what was coming. Across the town square, he saw a tall, furred shape standing on the edge of the crowd, watching the ceremony curiously. Chewie! Can't let him get drawn into this. The exaltation is going to come in just a couple of minutes. Han plunged into the crowd, keeping his head ducked, fighting his way through the throng as he would have clawed his way through a heavy surf. He was breathing hard and his elbows and ribs ached by the time he reached the Wookiee. Chewie! He yelled, grabbing the big sentient by the arm. Let's get out of here! This is gonna turn into a mob scene any second now. The Wookiee whined inquiringly. Never mind how I know. Han yelled above the chanting. I just know. Trust me. Chewbacca nodded and turned away, using his huge size to part the crowd before him. Han started to follow him, then something caught the corner of his eye, and he turned his head. A gleam of reddish gold on a stray curl. Han caught just a glimpse of her, but his whole mind and body jolted to a stop as though he'd slammed into a stone wall while running at top speed. Bria? Bria! He caught only that one brief glimpse of a pale, perfect profile and a stray reddish blonde curl, but it was enough. She was standing there, wearing a black cloak and hood, in this crowd. Memories came surging back, so strong that they scared him. Bria, a pale ghost of a slave in the spice factories of Ilesia. Bria, scared but determined as they robbed Taroenza of his treasures. Bria, sitting beside him on a golden sand beach on Tagoria, her mouth soft and red and just begging to be kissed. Bria, lying in his arms late at night. Bria, who had left him behind, saying she needed to fight her addiction to the Tyrande Till's exaltation by herself. Han had spent the past 5 years convincing himself that he'd forgotten her. After 4 years in the Imperial Academy, plus nearly a year of commissioned service, he'd been convinced that he no longer cared. But now, in a single searing blaze of insight, Han Solo knew he'd been lying to himself. Without hesitating, he turned and plunged back into the crowd, heading for the woman in the black cloak. He was halfway there when the exaltation hit the crowd, and the throng of sentients collapsed onto the cobblestones of the town square, as though they'd been stun-blasted. Han had forgotten how strong the exaltation was. Waves of intense pleasure rolled through his mind as well as his body. No wonder the Ilesian pilgrims thought the Tyrande Till were divinely gifted. Even knowing, as Han did, that the exaltation was caused by an empathic transmission coupled with a subsonic vibration that caused a wave of pleasure that acted on the brains of most bipedal sentients, Han had to brace himself to resist it. He knew without seeing it that the pouch beneath Veridal's chin had swelled, and that the Sacrodot was humming those vibrations as he concentrated on warm, positive emotions. To anyone unprepared for the force of the exaltation, the effect was as intoxicating as any pleasure drug. The ability to produce the exaltation was one that all Tyrande Till males shared. It was actually a sex-linked biological ability they possessed that, in their natural habitat, was used to attract Tyrande Till females. All around Han the crowd had fallen prone, and most of the sentients were writhing in pleasure. The sight sickened Han. He'd shaken off the effects of the exaltation now, and he concentrated on not stepping on bodies as he plunged toward the woman in the black cloak and hood. He could no longer see her face or that betraying tendril of hair. His fingers remembered the soft silkiness of that hair. He used to play with Bria's curls, watching them capture the light, bringing the reddish gold to vibrant life. The woman in the black cloak and hood disappeared behind a stone bench as the crowd heaved in a wave of ecstasy from the exaltation. Han swallowed hard. Bria had left him because she was addicted to the exaltation. Was that where she'd been for the past 5 years? A willing slave on Ilesia, bound to her Tyrande Till masters because she needed her daily dose of pleasure? Funny, he thought Bria had more strength than that. Han reached the stone bench, then stopped, staring around him. The woman in the black cloak was nowhere in sight. Where'd she go? Bria! Han thought, staring around him wildly. From all sides he could hear the gasps and moans of the crowd filling the air. He jumped up on the bench, straining his eyes, trying to pick up any trace of the woman in the black cloak. Han only realized what a terrible mistake he'd made when he found himself staring across the crowd, straight into the eyes of Veritil. The huge, four-legged creature with the tiny arms and the broad, single-horned head was staring back at him, his small, reddish eyes wide with surprise. The Corellian had no doubt that Veritil had just recognized him as VYKK Drago, the man who'd wrecked the Glitterstem factory, stolen Teroen's treasure, and caused the death of the Ilesian hut overlord, Zavel. All around Han the moans of pleasure suddenly altered into cries of dismay and loss. Veritil's attention had been diverted, and the exultation had come to an abrupt, jarring halt. Some of the throng wailed aloud, others jerked convulsively. Still others dragged themselves to their feet with cries of distress and anger. Han ducked his head and bolted forward, determined to lose himself in the crowd. And then, ahead of him, he caught a glimpse of black. Bria! Forgetting Veritil, forgetting the danger he was in, Han plunged forward, slamming into would-be pilgrims, tripping over feet, elbowing his fellow sentients aside. Bria! He yelled. Stop! Putting on a burst of speed, Han reached the edge of the crowd. The woman was running now, but Han was moving at top speed and he caught her in a dozen swift strides. Reaching out, he managed to grab the black fabric, yank her to a halt, then he grabbed her elbow and spun her around to face him. Only to find that the woman he chased was a total stranger. How could he have mistaken her for Bria? This woman wasn't homely, she was even pretty in a rather worn way, but Bria had been one of the loveliest women Han had ever seen. This woman's hair was dark blonde, not gold with warm reddish highlights. Bria had been tall. This woman was short. She was also angry. What do you think you're doing? She demanded in basic. Leave me alone or I'll summon security. I'm sorry. Han mumbled, stepped back, holding up both hands in as non-threatening a manner as he could manage. I thought you were someone else. Well, I feel sorry for her, the woman said huffily. With an ill-mannered, scruffy lout like you in her life. Look. Han continued to back away, hands up. I said I was sorry, sister. I'm doing okay? I think you'd better, she said pointedly. That priest has summoned security, I think. Han looked over his shoulder, cursed, then took to his heels, heading away from the crowd. He could see Chewbacca waiting for him, and waved to the Wookiee. He lengthened his stride, and a glance back at his pursuers reassured him that he was losing them. Been drinking too much, he decided as he ran. That's gotta be it. I'm gonna be more careful from now on, a lot more careful. Did Han get away? Bria then asked her friend as Lana Malo walked into the room, carrying Bria's black cloak under her arm. Bria was seated on the single human-styled chair in the cheap room they'd rented for their short stay on Deverin. I think so, Lana Malo replied, tossing the cloak to her friend, then picking up her travel bag and dumping it on the bed. The last I saw, he and that big Wookiee he was traveling with jumped into a public skimmer. Security was still on foot. My guess is he made it. He's probably off-world by now, Bria said softly, wistfully. Rising, she walked over to the window, then stood for a moment gazing up into Deverin's coral-tinted sky. Tears gathered in her blue-green eyes. I never thought I'd ever see him again. I never thought it would hurt so much. The pain she felt completely eclipsed the triumph she should have been experiencing. Today she'd faced the exaltation and successfully resisted it. After years of fighting her addiction to it, now she finally knew for certain that she was a free woman. She'd looked forward to this day for a long time, but any joy she felt was drowned in her grief at seeing Han again, and knowing she couldn't be with him. "Couldn't you have talked to him?" the shorter woman asked, almost echoing Bria's own thoughts. Bria turned from the window and watched her friend and comrade in arms pulling on her battered khaki-colored jacket. Quickly Lana stuffed the last of her personal belongings into the small travel bag. "What harm could it do?" she asked, giving Bria a sharp, quizzical glance. Bria shivered, then pulled the cloak around her shoulders. It was chilly, now that the sun was low on the horizon. "No," she said in a low voice. "I couldn't talk to him." "Why not?" Lana asked. "Don't you trust him?" Moving as methodically and carefully as a droid, Bria checked the charge in the blaster she wore strapped to her thigh, low down the way Han had taught her, 5 years ago, when they'd been partners, companions, lovers. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I trust him. I trust him with anything that's mine. But what we're trying to accomplish, that's not mine. That's all of us." Betrayal at this point could mean the end of the entire movement. "I couldn't risk it." Lana nodded. "Solo's showing up when he did sure messed up our plans," she said. "No telling when we'll get a clear shot at Veritil again. My guess is that he'll hightail it back to Ilesia to tell Teruans that he spotted your ex-boyfriend." Bria nodded tiredly as she ran her hands through her hair. Han loved to do that, she thought with a sudden surge of memory so vivid that it felt like a blow. "Oh, Han." Lana Malo gave her an assessing glance that was half sympathetic, half cynical. "You can fall apart later, Bria. Right now we've got to catch the transport back to Corellia. The commander's going to expect a full report. Even if we failed to take out Veritil, we still succeeded in making contact with the Deveronian group, so the trip wasn't a total waste." "I'm not going to fall apart," Bria said dully, holstering her blaster without looking at it, the way Han had taught her. "I got over Han long ago." "Sure you did," Lana agreed, not unkindly, as the two women picked up their bags and headed for the door. "Sure you did." End of Star Wars: The Paradise Snare. Han Solo Trilogy Book 1. By A.C. Crispin.